Hello friends, welcome back to the Holy Comforter Episcopal Church YouTube Bible Study. I'm Jimmy Abbott, the priest here at Holy Comforter, and we are looking at the scripture lessons for Sunday, August 20th, 2017. The gospel lesson is Matthew chapter 15, verses 10 through 28. Real quickly, I actually would not be preaching on this passage, though it's a very interesting passage. You'll actually see when you're reading it, Matthew 15, 10 through 28, there are two sections. The first one is Jesus teaching about defilement. And he talks about how it's not what goes into a person that defiles, it's about what comes out of a person that defiles, or to makes clean or unclean. I think this really... back in Jesus' day, there were all sorts of ritual purification rules, which were good things because they helped keep the community clean. So you got to remember, kind of going back then, that these rules were in place for the health of the community. But Jesus kind of spins this back and says, but that's not really what makes a person holy or not holy. It's what comes out of the person, because it's what comes out that is adultery or murder or theft or evil. So think about that in your own life. I think we see this happen a lot of times in churches and with Christians, that we create all these rules for ourselves, and the rules are good things, but the rules themselves are not what make us holy or not. It's about how we live out those rules, about how we live our walk with Jesus. That's really what will show us if we're living with God or not. The second half of this passage is Jesus' sort of notorious, famous interaction with the Canaanite woman. In other Gospels, she's known as the Syrophoenician woman. And there's this interesting sort of interplay between Jesus and this woman about if this woman, does Jesus call her a dog, which is sort of disconcerting. Is that a racial slur because she's not Jewish? Or is this Jesus being coy with her and sort of trying to draw faith out of her? It's a really complex passage, and I think that many commentators and theologians will go back and forth on this one. What I find comfort in, because at the end of the story, Jesus talks about this woman's faith and sort of commends her for it. And I think that's the most interesting thing there, is that for us, it's we see that God sort of transcends all those racial and ethnic boundaries, which, oh my gosh, isn't that the lesson that we need to hear in 2017 in the United States of America, that God kind of can go beyond those barriers that we have falsely constructed for ourselves. So when you read that story, maybe you can kind of keep in mind all that we've been hearing and seeing concerning race and racism in the United States. I'll be preaching on Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 through 15. I wish that we could read the entire second half of Genesis and the Joseph story. So we get a little bit of the Joseph story here. If y'all remember from the musical Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers into Egypt. Joseph and his brothers are the sons of Jacob. Jacob is the son of Isaac. Isaac is the son of Abraham. Right. So Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt, but it turns out Joseph sort of works his way up in the Egyptian power structure, becomes one of the aides to the Pharaoh, and when there's a great famine back where Joseph is from, and his brothers then come to Egypt, looking for food, looking for bread, Joseph is the one who is able to provide that for them. And it's really interesting how Joseph sees this. He knows that his brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt, but the way he's able to reflect back on it is that he says it's like God sent me ahead to go to Egypt so that when you were hungry, I would be here ready to provide for you. It's not in this passage, but it's a little bit later on. Joseph says, "You intended it for evil, but God intended it for good." I think that a lot of times when we look back on our lives, we can see those moments where there were evil and bad things happening. And we can be clear, Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers is a bad thing. However, God is able to make good out of that. My spiritual director this week put it up. God is where the action is. God is where the action is. And so maybe you can think about in your own life, where are those places where there is tension right now, where there is stress, where there is stuff happening? Maybe that's actually where God is. Not that God is creating that tension or that stress, but maybe God will be able to work through that to create something new in you, or to create something good for the wider community. So maybe we can think about the Joseph story along those lines. Speaking personally, many of y'all know that I'm a type 1 diabetic. That is not something that I would have ever wished on myself or anybody, really. But I think through it, I have learned more about compassion and empathy, because I know what it means to be sick. I know what it means to be chronically sick. I know what it means to be ill. I think that has been then a gift that I can give back. Again, not that I ever wish that I had this, but God is making lemonade out of lemons. So again, think about that in your own life. What are those places that you may not necessarily like or want, but what are some ways that maybe God is working through that? And maybe that's also the lesson that we need for the United States of America, as we are, again, bumping up against out there racism. This is very much in the forefront, and God is where the action is. So maybe God is doing something new in us, or through all of this, God is uncovering some new things, some new ways for us to move forward. I know it's a complex thing, because we don't want to say that God created that suffering or created that evil. And we want to make sure that we don't sort of idolize that. But I think as Christians, we do believe, as Jesus died on the cross, that through evil and through suffering, God has been able to make good, because that is also the story of the cross. Thank you all for joining me. You can leave a comment or send me an email, jimmy@holycomforterspring.org. Thank you.